Art and creativity has always been an integral part of my life. But more important than the end product has always been my conscious experience of inspiration. Now, this all began when I was about 5 years old with an event that has always stuck out in my mind. I grew up in the day when a milkman delivered the milk in glass bottles, and I decided that I was going to pour myself a glass of milk. Well, of course, at 5 years old, this didn't go very well, and before I knew it, the bottle slipped out of my hands and was a busted mess all over the floor. And in that moment, it's like something stepped inside of my mind, because I was taken into an altered state, and the only way I can describe it is that real time seemed to slow down and consciousness time seemed to speed up. And what it showed to me was first a visual scenario of the standard outplay, which was I screamed, I cried, I called for mom, the typical drama, the instinctual response. But then it showed me an alternate take where I could soak up the milk with a towel, sweep up the glass, and then go about my day like everything was just fine. And then the inspirational moment left. And I was left there to think about it for a moment, and I decided that I was going to go the new path and clean up the mess and just stay calm. Some people believe that this all comes from within your own mind. Einstein didn't. He called it the mystical experience and believed that it was the true foundation of not only science, but art. And in terms of what I consciously experienced, it was decades ahead of my emotional and conscious development, and it would be decades later before I would unwrap all the implications and what it opened up in terms of new options of thought and life. The spilt milk event was definitely a game changer, because it showed me that no matter how my mind wanted to interpret the reality in front of it, there was always an alternate take. For every negative interpretation of life, there was always a positive option. When I was fighting depression, which was a propensity that ran in my family, this understanding became invaluable. What I learned was that every emotional response, every interpretation of life was initially presented to the mind as just a potential. And there was a window of opportunity that varied in length, to where if you redirected your thoughts and didn't participate in the thoughts that were an activator of the emotional event, you could bypass it. You could preempt it. The mystical experience is like coming to a fork in the road that has just been created by the inspirational ideas. And then inspiration withdraws. The reason I believe is because it absolutely respects your free will, and to remain, its very presence would create a bias. So at this fork in the road, any force of influence or bias falls into the category of coercion, even something arising within your own mind, because this path is a path that you have never been down, and so no aspect of your consciousness could have an accurate opinion in regards to whether it was good or bad, right or wrong. Most humans in their conscious and behavioral choices would concede that they are following a feeling. So my experience with the emotional bias, this emotional push, whether it be following your heart, whether it be following your gut, whether it be following your instincts, is when you try to oppose that emotional push, it exposes that those thoughts, those biases do not respect your free will, because the way they respond is they push harder and seem to fight change instead of embracing change, like the inspirational thoughts. In the world that we presently live in, it is very commonly accepted and popular to say, follow your heart. And so I'm throwing out the question, is this really the decision-making model that we should be following? Why do the thoughts that we are born into have no respect for our free will? In fact, the intensity is so great that it extends beyond ourselves to where we inherently do not respect the free will of others. In a book called The Keys of Enoch, an interesting idea is proposed. Reading in the glossary under the heading Mind, the linkage capsule. Now, the closest comparative that I can give to this is the cell phone. The reality that we experience in this cell phone is not contained within the phone alone. This phone is in actuality just a linkage capsule to a much greater reality than could ever be self-contained within the phone alone. Continuing on, Enoch said the mind is localized in consciousness. Consciousness is not localized in the mind. So the paradigm of reality that we perceive is not produced by our mind alone, but comes from a much greater consciousness field that the mind swims in. Now, a brief overview of what Enoch presents is that in the creation of our local universe, some of the beings involved with that creative process went rogue and created a counterfeit consciousness field to replace the original conscious field we were intended to swim in. The original fields that we were intended to swim in was Orion and the Pleiades. And what they created was a counterfeit version of that Enoch states resides in the star regions of Alpha Draconis and the Big Bear, Ursa Major, which makes it no surprise that our North Star, as a star in the arm of the Big Dipper, is part of the constellation of Ursa Major. And as Enoch states, we are circumscribed to these fields because of the conscious pressure that they play upon the mind, jamming out our awareness of the higher consciousness fields of the Pleiades and Orion. In an esoteric writing called the Book of You, spelled I-E-O-U, Christ's apostles are asking him questions after his resurrection. And this is what he says to them. To send the earth to heaven is that he who hears the word of gnosis has ceased to have the understanding mind of man of earth, but has become a man of heaven. His understanding mind has ceased to be earthly, but it has become heavenly. Now, this sounds to me a lot like Mission Impossible. So I put it to you in this way. Your mission, should you choose to accept it in being born on this earth, is to learn to cease to have the understanding mind of man, which is to free yourself from the fallen consciousness fields that we are born into and learn to only have the understanding mind of heaven, which is to move your consciousness within the fields of Orion and the Pleiades, where you only entertain thoughts that are of divine origin, that respect your free will and embrace change.